Record button. So you had 3 inquiries on the table for your breakout rooms. The first one being, why is the distinction of Black sociology important or of a necessity? 2, what were your thoughts on the notion of white sociology as being the science of oppression? And 3, what did you find most intriguing about the reading? Who would like to share what was discussed in your breakout rooms?
I will go.
Thank you, Nicole.
Basically, what we talked about is each of our readings for last week. And what I wrote specifically was this week's reading starts off defining the term of Black sociology, which is the study of Black communities as a whole, as well as the different aspects that create the whole to define it. The main concern for the Black movement is the issue of culture. In history, white people have oppressed the Black communities to assimilate and adapt to the white culture while losing the history of Black culture. Either due to fear of beatings, lynching, death, or separation from their family. Hence, they strive to keep the Black culture alive and not forgotten, to rebuild and add to this culture that has existed for all of time. Most importantly, through Black studies, to incorporate the foundations of human culture and how Black culture contributed to what is practiced today. So in regards to the question, far as white sociology, something of oppression, I think it's, they have this model of, just like you said before, the white wealthy man. I believe that back then and maybe even still today, they're trying to, make the Black community assimilate to this idea of white culture, and they're losing their culture by assimilating.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's a lot also kind of picked up in how he talks about the shift from the integrationist movement to a more radical and more Black nationalist movement. So good call out, Nicole, thank you. Who else would like to share what was discussed in their breakout rooms? Let's get 2 more and we'll move to my notes. You could volunteer, I could volunteer, tell you, it's up to y'all. Kevin, what was discussed in your group?
So for my group, I discussed the distinction of Black sociology needed. I believe Black sociology is needed because it's an understanding of people and their culture. And for me, I'm an anthropology major, so I deal with a lot of understanding and learning about other people's cultures and beliefs. And in order to help further understanding of who humans and people we are today, we have to go around learning about everybody, all their cultures. It's not just about one specific group. All peoples are needed, regardless of the size of the population or the wealth of one population over the other.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. How far are you in the discipline of anthropology? I understand you're in junior college, but how many courses and what have you took?
I've taken, well, with I am now, I've taken 1 anthropology class, which was last semester, which was cultural anthropology. Right now I'm in physical anthropology.
Okay. So I'm trying to think of the best way to articulate this to you without deterring you from your discipline, right? I'll say this, be very critical in how you hear how they talk about certain people, especially in the discipline of anthropology, especially when you start to talk about like early anthropology, right? Because a lot of these stereotypes and a lot of these negative perceptions that the Western world has about Africa, they stem from anthropology, right? A lot of the work in the early stages of anthropology that was done was to justify the oppressive treatment that the Western world gave to Africans, right? So, well, we can enslave these people because anthropological studies show that they are a society that has no advancement, right? So I just say, be very careful and very critical in how you hear these anthropologists talk about other cultures. Because another thing with that's kind of I don't want to say reticent, because if you pay attention, you know it's there. They gain these theses, right, without really understanding the cultures that they're studying, right? You can't have a full conceptualization of a culture if you don't speak their language, right? And oftentimes these anthropologists would go into these cultures, right, especially what Spivak calls the subaltern culture, or what Frantz Fanon may call the wretched of the earth, right? They would go into these spaces not understanding the languages, not understanding the interrelated dynamics of these cultures, and they would make epistemology, they would make knowledge based on that limited understanding, and the whole Western world would believe that to be true, right? So I just say be very, very careful in how you engage anthropology. I remember I took an anthropology, it was an African anthropology class in my undergrad. And the professor he was a brother from Ethiopia. And I had to leave the class because the pervasive racism that was just so prevalent in that course, right? And I don't want to say it's not his fault, because at some degree he does have some self-responsibility, but he was a product of his training, right? To where he could even articulate his own people as being subhuman, right? And this is from Ethiopia is a country that was never conquered by European forces, right? And he still has the wherewithal mentally to situate Africa and African people as subhuman. So I'm not saying stay out of or get out of anthropology, but be critical in how you engage anthropology. And Kevin, you may be the one to kind of course correct or open up another branch of anthropology that can do it in a more ethical type of way. Let's get one more comment.
Well, yeah, like you said, yeah. We definitely did talk about that in my class last semester, and my Professor Jeffrey Rigby, he was very careful to like. He explained to us that like he himself, he would like he didn't speak the languages too well. He would speak it somewhat, but he would go out there and actually like live and like with other cultures. Like I know I think he said he's been to like Africa like 7 times. He's been to the Amazon. He's been a lot over the world. And he never viewed any of these people as subhuman, as he stated.
Yeah.
He like obviously he'd be surprised or shocked by some of the things that they would do, but he always just viewed it as that's part of their culture. That's just what they believe in. Just like how we are like, if you took someone from where they're at, and bring them to where we are society, it'd be just as shocking to them.
Right.
So that was just something I learned from the class.
Yeah, and I would say keep that. Like that's a really brilliant piece of information that your professor laid out for you, because not all anthropologists approach it from that way, right? And I think hopefully, right, with the advent of time, and they're able to kind of catch up with the rest of society and see how some of these practices are no longer applicable. So I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Can we get one more comment before we move on to my notes about what was discussed in the breakout room? Claudia, what was talked about in your breakout room?
Yes, we spoke about our favorite part, since we already defined the importance of Black sociology. I really liked how it calls it project and interest of oppression, and they look at white sociology as the science of oppression and Black sociology as the science of liberation. And we're also talking about Dr. Harold Cruz, the Crucian paradigm. Yeah, and I forgot who was in my group, but she shared how she really liked that a real recovery requires a practice of freedom, which cannot be fully achieved in oppression, and thus necessitates revolutionary practice to end oppression and open up the way to freedom.
Yeah.
And I really liked where he also talks about how like Negro intellectuals should go against basically the brainwashed white America, like the sheep, to tell them that their days of grace are numbered. Just because there's that idea of like that they are still in power. But if you really see, it's not really like that anymore. And I think it's just important to educate people on it so that they understand more, where it's not like Christopher Columbus discovered America mentality.
Right. Yeah. Very, very astute call out, Claudia. Thank you. One of the things I kind of want to touch on before I go into my notes is some of the things that Nicole was musing on. And I just want to provide a little bit more of a context to that conversation, because what she's pulling from is directly from the text, right? And that's why I'm saying she's not wrong, but just to add a little bit more context. And I only do this because I know Maulana Karenga, who is the author, I know his positionality in the movement of the 60s, right? And he was considered by and large what they would call a cultural nationalist. So in the 60s, especially here in California, right? There was a great bifurcation in how the Black Power movement would look and feel, right? And it could be embodied in two organizations, one being the Black Panther Party, and then the other being the US organization. And US is short for United Slaves. And US was ran by Maulana Karenga and the former chair of the Pan-African Studies Department at Cal State LA, CRD Halisi, who I took classes with him, I studied underneath him, very brilliant, very, very brilliant scholar. But way they situated how the Black Power movement should look and feel was through cultural identity, right? So they all would change their names to African names. The attire that they wore would be African garb, a lot of dashikis and things of that nature. The practice of libations and a lot of these cultural practices that were very predominant in Africa, this cultural nationalist faction of the Black Power movement picked those things up and ran with them, right? Whereas the Black Power movement and how it manifested through the Black Panther parties, their core concern, was political power, right? So they didn't really care so much about the cultural nationalism in the sense of what we wear, in the sense of changing our names and things of that nature. They believe that the sole focus should be power, right? And we're gonna centralize our efforts to shift the way that power relates to the Black community, right? And their thing was, we're going to do very practical, we're going to take very practical means to start to siphon our power back into our communities. This is why you had things like the free breakfast program. This is why you had things like the sickle cell program that the Black Panthers did. In fact, one of the first activist actions of the Black Panther Party was to set up a stop sign on a corner, right? There was a particular corner in Oakland where young children just kept getting hit by cars, And they would take this to Oakland City officials. They did nothing about it. So what Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale did was they just took a stop sign and stood at that corner and played crossing guard to make sure that children had safe passage to and from, right? So again, very practical means of reestablishing Black power within the Black community. So I just want to say that to show you, yes, this idea of cultural nationalism is very prevalent in this moment of the 60s, but it wasn't the only way that we went about advocating for our situation, right? Black power looked a lot different than cultural nationalism, and a lot of what the Black Power movement did and the Black Panthers iteration of the Black Power movement was to take very practical means, right, to establish power within the community. So if they seen someone being pulled over by the police, they would do what's called police patrol. They would make sure that there was no foul play being done when these police would engage citizens, right? So again, very practical ways of establishing self-determination within the community, right? So, and again, not to say that you're wrong, Nicole, you're spot on, and how the reading talks about the role of culture and the power of culture, but I believe that's so emphasized because who wrote the book, being Maulana Karenga, who himself was one of the foremost proponents of cultural nationalism. we hear a little bit of dirt, right? A little bit of Black revolutionary dirt from the 60s. Anybody familiar with UCLA? I'm sure y'all know what UCLA is, the college. On UCLA, they have the Bunchy Center, right? So a lot of the Black departments, Black activities and things are ran through this Bunchy Center. The Bunchy Center is named for Apprentice Bunchy Carter, right? And Bunchy Carter was the one of the baddest motherfuckers in LA, man. Just kind of call it what it is, right? He was a Slauson gang member. So if you know LA, right, especially South LA, there's a street called Slauson that runs damn near from like downtown area all the way to like the western portion of Los Angeles, right? And back in the day, so where like Central is in Los Angeles, kind of like southern downtown portion of LA, that was really like the Black hub, right? So how we think about South Central being like the Black location of LA now, that was more so Southeast LA. So if you think about the street Central in downtown LA, that would be like the hub of where Black folks kind of located, just like how Crenshaw is that hub now, okay? So what Bunchy was able to do was organize the Slauson gangs that kind of ran from East LA all the way to the western part of LA and politicize them and make them Black Panthers, right? So essentially all the gangs, the Slausons, the businessmen, I don't believe the 60s were in play yet. I believe the businessmen turned into the 60s. It's predominantly the Slausons and the businessmen at that time. He converted them into Black Panthers, right? So this is what's going on in South Los Angeles during the 60s. So a lot of the members who made up the Black Panther Party LA were former gang members, right? And gangs weren't how they were now, right? Really what gangs were at this time were social clubs that would protect Black folks from white violence. This is what gangs, the purpose that gangs serve. But what happens is UCLA is about to have their, about to kick off their African American Studies program. And they were having a question as to who would run the program, because naturally they don't have the professors to run the program the way that it should be run. So they looked to the community to do so. So the options were the Black Panther Party and the US organization. They have a meeting at UCLA to determine who would be they would have allow the students to vote. Whoever the students voted for would be the ones that would take over the program. Things kind of come to head and CIA infiltrated US members. Say that again so you make sure you catch that. CIA, who infiltrated the US organizations as members of the US organization, end up murdering Bunchy Carter and John Huggins, two of the really foremost leaders in the Black Panther Party of Los Angeles. And this is why you have Bunchy Hall in UCLA to honor Bunchy Carter, right? So the tensions between the US organization and the Black Panther parties really get violent. It really stems the head. And that tension is really, the gas is poured on the fire by the CIA and by COINTELPRO. They would do things like sending letters to the US organization signed by members of the Black Panther Party, having some really dirty remarks about members of the US organization and vice versa, right? So they would, kind of fan the flames, if you will, to create this tension. In fact, the same tactics would be used when the gangs in Los Angeles would try to start truces. So like in '95, there was a tremendous gang truce in LA. And they would use the same tactics that they used against the US and the Black Panthers to end those gang truces, doing things like stealing. So for example, let's say, it's not even an example, this has really happened. Stealing a well-known blood member's car, right? So everybody knows that this brother is part of the Bloods, that's his car, right? So the police would take the car, drive into Crip territory and pull drive-bys, right? So this would undermine the idea of the truce, right? Because if you think about what the police is doing, especially in the mid-90s, a lot of their profit came from gang prevention task force, right? So if you're getting money for gang prevention task force and there are no gangs, what are you going to do with the money? So it's profitable for this gang activity to continue. And the police had a tremendous role in making sure that that tensions played out. And a lot of these tactics that they developed stem from their involvement in the Black Power and the civil rights movements in the 60s and 70s. So that's like our mini lecture before we get into the real shit, right? Looking at Pierre's comment here, Kadawida theories is, Kadawida is Swahili word meaning tradition, reason. Swahili is spoken by over 15,000 million people in the 11 countries. So it's the largest spoken language in Africa, right? In Southern and East Africa, by using Kadawida to convey his idea of culture isn't Karanga following the path traced by Garvey. Okay. This cultural nationalism is linked to the quest for origins, which was developed by Karanga in the 1960s and at the heat of the struggle for civil rights and human rights. Is it still relevant today when everyone gets used to the idea that we will be woven and mixed by the culture? Yes. So, and to Baba Pierre's point, right? I think what you see now is the fusion of Black power as it manifested through the Black Panther parties and cultural nationalism as it manifested through the ORS organization. So a lot of how activists think about this now is in the terms of bringing these two seemingly bifurcated thoughts together, right? Because if you think about it, you do need cultural nationalism. That is important because that gives you a sense of yourself, right? But you also need that political power to just maintain the things that you build, right? So they go hand in hand. And I think what Baba Pierre is picking up is how they really work better together than apart. And the enemy, right, was able to use those divisions to destroy a very profitable movement for African people. And you're also right, Baba Pierre, in the sense of this was pulled directly from the work of Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey viewed cultural nationalism and political power as one and the same, right? And I think a lot of what we see now in the contemporary organization and activism within the Black community is the merging of the two cultural nationalist thoughts and the Black power tendencies. So thank you for that, Baba Pierre. All right, let's get into the notes. It's gonna sound a little redundant because Nicole already gave us a very succinct definition of sociology, but again, Black sociology is the critical study and functioning of the Black community as a whole, as well as the various units and processes which compose and define it, and relations with people and forces external to it, right? So not only looking at interrelated communication and interrelated relations within the community, right? But also being attentive to the outside forces and how they impact the community as part of the sociological project, right? And it says that Black sociology understands the established order of sociology as a project in the interest of oppression. As Staples argues, right? If white sociology is the science of oppression, Black sociology must be the science of liberation. So let me point out two things, right? As an intellectual, when you hear terms like must be, when you hear terms like ought to be, right? Start to think in your mind, these are ethical claims, right? This is dealing with the science or the thoughts of ethics, how the world should operate, right? So, and we see how this plays out within this reading, but as a whole, when you hear things like must be, should be, ought to be, in your mind, you should pop up with, oh, we're getting into a ethical argument, right? So start to think about ethics. So let's deal with the claim, right? And I want to unpack this idea and this notion that white sociology is a science of oppression, because we don't have to believe that to be true just because it's within the text, right? If I'm teaching you to be critical readers and engage material critically, even this material should be engaged critically, right? And we can't take this for face value just because it came from this textbook, right? So let's think about, is sociology a science of oppression? How is white sociology a science of oppression? And what evidence can we find that would allow us to believe this claim to be true? So can anybody provide me an example possibly, or just kind of speak to why they feel, from an evidential standpoint, from a standpoint of evidence, right? Not just making up or what you think, but some concrete evidence, why white sociology can be situated as a science of oppression. Has anyone took a sociology course? No. That was my major in my undergrad. So let's think about some of the work that sociology does. Let's take the Black off of sociology, right? And to provide like a working definition is to understand and make sense of the social milieu, right? And the social milieu is just the group of people, right? So just to help you understand and better conceptualize the society that you're studying or the society that you're a member of, right? So if we are to study and to understand this society and to make sense of this society, you can't really do so effectively, right? And leave out racism, right? And I would argue that sociologists who do seek to not engage racism within their sociological practice are doing the work implicitly, right, of maintaining that system, right? Another way to think about this, there's a book called The First R, and it's an educational book, right? When I was doing my master's work in education, I was introduced to this book, and it says that it tries to explain how children from kindergarten to second grade perform racism, right? And the overall thesis is that this racism is not really a learned behavior, right? So it's not the product of white parents teaching their children to be racist or white schooling institutions teaching their students to be racist. That's not what happens. America is a racist society, right? So children who are being socialized within the society are gonna embody racism because it's in the society, it's in the cartoons, it's in the literature, it's in all aspects of American society, right? So what the author argues is, as it pertains to the white parents, right? No, they're not teaching their children racism, but by not talking about racism to their children, they're allowing it to perpetuate, right? Because they're gonna get this information from somewhere. So it would behoove the parents to kind of course correct that before they get this from an outside source and provide them the appropriate context, right? So I bring up this example to kind of make the parallel with sociology. So if dominant sociology, white sociology, is not in the practice of dispelling the racist myths that this society is founded on, then they're complicit in the racism that exists within the society. And one could use that as an argument to support the fact that white sociology engaged in the science of oppression, right? That's one theoretical line of thought that we could use to make this, to attach to this argument, right? One of the well-known, well, I don't know, nobody took a sociology class yet, right? Okay, so one of the well-known, one of the foremost thinkers in sociology is Karl Marx, right? Karl Marx is famous for his class critique. He has a very profound critique of capitalism and critique of class. What Karl Marx does not engage in is an intersectional critique of racism and race, right? So even if you're following some of the foremost proponents of this discipline, of this thought, they don't seek to engage in race. And when they did their sociological studies, there were no African people there to even think about race, right? So if I'm doing my work in Germany, where there are no African people, it's not gonna allow me to have a robust and a comprehensive view of how societies impact race. So one, you can't really fault Marx for not dealing with what's not there, right? But we also can't say that this is the most comprehensive theory if we're leaving a large segment of the population out, right? So again, to me, these are some of the examples that could be used to support the claim that's being made in the text that white sociology is a discipline and a science that is concerned with oppression, right? And you have to also understand the role that sociologists played in constructing this society, right? No one can argue that this is a anti-racist society, right? No one in their right mind can make that claim, right? So if there are sociologists who played an instrumental role in constructing the society that's steeped and embedded in racism, then one could also argue that sociology is a science that's based on oppression, right? And if we think about how Karenga articulates the aims and the goals of Black studies, right? And how he talks about having to expand beyond intellectual brilliance, right? And you have to have this activist component where you engage the community, then it would make sense as to why Black sociology would be a science that's concerned with liberation, right? And if we are going to study the functionings of the Black community as a whole, right? And as well as the various units and processes which comprise, define, and the relation and its relations with people and external forces, you have to look at the role of oppression, right? You have to look at how these oppressive forces are impacting the quotidian, the daily lives of African people, right? And if you're gonna do that serious, what would be the point of engaging in that practice without thinking about ways to right the wrong, right? So naturally, Black sociology would then become the science of liberation, right? And again, I tease all this out. Go ahead, speak on that out loud, Unique, because you make a very good point.
I was just saying social psychology also plays a part because of these social psychologists who go out, who are scientists and doctors who go out into communities that are quote unquote oppressed. They play the role in feeding like media, like their marketing towards keeping people in this mindset of like, I can't do better, or let me throw pity and cater to like the racist views of people who are not willing to educate themselves or go outside of their own community to really get a picture of the truths of our country.
Yeah, and I think for me, if you really want to do some real critical, psychological, analytical work, you have to engage the work of Frantz Fanon. I'm thinking particularly the text, Black Skin, White Mass, which is his dissertation. And it's a psychoanalytic approach and almost a phenomenological or existential approach to how these ideas of racism and oppression play out within the psyche of the Black mind, and how that psyche of how it plays out within the psyche of the Black mind affects, not effects, but affects the experiences of the Black body, right? So I would say if you really want to get into some psychological, psychoanalytic work, you have to engage Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Mass. Okay, and then he goes into discussing the basic aims of Black sociology, to rescue Black life from racist interpretations. I'm gonna paraphrase these. To create new concepts and categories that enhance the understandings of both Black life and the larger realities of US society. 3, ongoing critical analysis of race, class, and gender. 4, to join in the criticism and the internal forces negative to Black progress and liberty with criticism of negative external forces, right? So we're gonna also look at the issues that plague our community from inside of our community, and then the issues that plague our community that are from outside the community. And then discover and develop the possibilities. And I don't wanna gloss over this idea and the importance of possibility, right? And to me, when we get into conversations around possibility, we're dealing with the imagination, right? And to me, the imagination is the most fecund and most useful site of investigation because it offers limitless potential, right? So I don't want us to minimize the power of possibility, right? So to discover and develop the possibilities of social change inherent in both the Black community and the larger society, right? So the idea and the possibility, expansive as that may be, of social change, not only for the Black society and the Black community, but the larger society as a whole, right? W.E.B. Du Bois makes an appearance within our within this chapter. So I mentioned Marx. I'm going to also mention Weber. These are the foremost European thinkers when it comes to sociology. W.E.B. Du Bois, the first Black man to graduate with a Ph.D. from Harvard. Upon doing so, And upon receiving his degree, he told them, I assure you the pleasure was yours, right? That's a very eloquent way to say fuck y'all, right? Father of sociology. He comes, I believe, to Harvard with a master's degree, I want to say from Fisk. They reject his master's degree from Fisk. They tell him if he wants to come here, you have to get another master's. So he goes across the seas to Germany, and he learns in the Frankfurt School. So at this time, though, right, Germany was at the apex of intellectual thought. So when he went to the school in Frankfurt and he's sitting in these classrooms, his classmates were Marx, were Weber, right? All of these core thinkers in this discipline that we call sociology were Du Bois's contemporaries. And so when they left and they graduated, they went and did their sociological work. Du Bois came back to Harvard with his second master's and he did his PhD work. And then Du Bois produces the text that's mentioned in our chapter, The Philadelphia Negro, which is the first documented sociological study in the United States, right? So this is proof positive that W.E.B. Du Bois is the father of American sociology, not Black sociology, of American sociology, period. And this is supported also by the works of Relin Rabaka in the book Africana Critical Theory, right? So they argue and situate, in which I believe to be true, W.E.B. Du Bois as the father of American sociology. Another phenomenal text that he's produced is The Souls of Black Folks, published in 1906. Also could be understood as a sociological text, right? Because he's articulating, he's thinking about, he's meditating on the desires of the souls of people who you call Black, right? And he goes through various essays to kind of further elucidate upon what the desires of the souls of Black folks are, right? So we can't really talk about sociology, whether it be Black sociology, white sociology, period. You cannot have that conversation without engaging the brilliance of W.E.B. Du Bois. From the early 1900s to the 1970s, I believe, he's producing intellectual work. His final production is the Encyclopedia Africaine, which he's producing on his deathbed in Ghana under the tutelage of Kwame Nkrumah, who is the president of the first liberated country in Africa, which would be Ghana, right? So again, the brilliance, the W.E.B. Du Bois could have his own seminar, right? Like the level of his brilliance is uncanny. Really phenomenal and foundational work on Black Reconstruction. He has a book entitled Black Reconstructions, over like 1,300 pages. Really comprehensive and brilliant work. Okay, and then so he moves from Du Bois and works through questions of class and race and racism. And he says that race cannot be, this is Karenga, racism cannot be reductively translated as a function of class or race struggle, right? So it cannot strictly be reduced to being a function of class struggle, right? Or just simply a race struggle. It cannot be that. Such a position obscures the complexity and the variousness of their interplay and their separate relevance in a racist capitalist society, right? So racism and classism work hand in hand. They cannot be separated. He says to do so is a reductionist approach. You have to think about how race and capital work hand in hand, right? Because as the racism of the plantation system was manifesting in the southern portion of the country, right? And proliferating through parts of the northern portion of the country, right? Capital was being ensued, right? When you think about the stock market in our society today, right? The first material on the stock market were Black bodies. That's the first stock, right? And the first stock brokers were the individuals who would make the sales exchange of these Black bodies. In fact, not hyperbole, historical information, Wall Street, where Wall Street is at, was one of the first places where they would do these auctions. right? So America doesn't change, it just evolves its oppression and changes the terminology, right? So this is an example of how you cannot separate race from class. They're tied together. In fact, the racism of enslavement produced the capital that allowed this country to be a capitalist society. You have to view them as one and the same. Another great text for that. Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams. He does a very, very comprehensive job of articulating how capitalism and racism worked hand in hand to build this country. So he moves forward and he gets to Marxism. I'm already kind of gave you some insight about Marx, but he says Marxists and non-Marxists tend to see racism as simply attitudes or ideology, rather than a multifaceted phenomenon and process involving ideology, structure, and practice, right? Because at the end of the day, if you think about it, you can't oppress someone with an idea, right? It has to take action in order to oppress someone. One of my favorite ancestors, Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, would always say, I don't care what you think about me. I don't care. In your mind, you can call me a nigga all you want. But at the time that you try to make the physical act of trying to lynch me, then we have a problem, right? So what Kwame is saying, the ideas, the ideology of racism has no implications on the body, right? But when the ideas become practice, then racism is manifested, right? Ideas is prejudice, right? If we're going to use terminology, idea is a prejudice. I think this about a certain group of people. I have a prejudice against these certain people, and they stop at the idea, right? But once I act on that idea, then it becomes racism, right? And this is what the author is saying. Oftentimes, those who ascribe to Marxism, and even those who don't ascribe to Marxism, right? They only want to reduce racism to the idea and not think about how the idea relates to the practice and the practice relates to policy, right? Because when the practice shifts to policy, that's when racism becomes institutionalized. Another book, if you want to dive deeper into that, it's called Black Power, The Politics of Liberation and Power. And that's by Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and Charles Hamilton. I'm almost wrapping this up, y'all. And then this idea of deficit paradigm, right? And you can see deficit paradigm also applied to deficit model teaching. And this is the assumption that students of culture don't have the intellectual capacity to achieve greatness, right? And so what we'll do is we'll dumb down the lesson plan to make sure that it's applicable to the way that they're able to learn, right? For me, I do the direct opposite of deficit model approach to teaching. I'm not so much in this class because the subject matter and the material of the course is already laid out within the book, right? But in the classes, for example, that I put together at Cal State LA, I literally pull books from my PhD reading, right? So the students in my class at Cal State LA are engaging in materials that are at a PhD level, right? Because I don't believe that they're not capable of being able to rise to that challenge. I believe that they are capable of doing so. That's why I give them the material. And 10 times out of 10, 11 times out of 10, these students rise to that challenge, right? So I know from a practical standpoint, right, that this notion of deficit model thinking as it pertains to education is bullshit, because the students who engage my class are being prepared to get a PhD, and they're familiarizing themselves with PhD work right out of high school, right out of junior college, right? But this idea of deficit paradigms, it says that, and this is Monahan who makes this claim, for the Black person is only an American and nothing else. He has no values and culture to guard and protect, right? And for me, the reason why I bring this up is because this speaks to the power of Pan-Africanism, right? And I believe at the beginning of the semester, I let you know that I'm a Pan-African educator, right? My dissertation is on producing a Pan-African pedagogy, right? And this notion of Pan-Africanism connects the African experience to wherever you are in the world, right? So for me, I don't even consider myself an African American. I'm an African in America at best, right? And this connects my culture to beyond just what happened to us within this 400 years that we were placed within the Americas, right? I trace my culture back to the 8 million years that African people have been on this planet, right? So for me, what that does, what Pan-Africanism does, it destroys and implodes this notion that Monahan is making that we have no culture, right? In fact, the reality of what happened is our culture was interrupted by the experience of enslavement, right? And what now has become is us trying to piece back together our culture or produce new iterations of culture based on the interruption, right? And for me, what are things like Creole, but an adaptation of African culture that has been adapted to the way that the Americas has interrupted our natural progression, right? Because if you think about Creole, right, it's a mixture of Caribbean, African, French, located here in the Americas. You go to New Orleans, they speak, some of them have French last names, right? So this notion of Creole is a African cultural adaptation that is produced through the interruption that was enslavement. Yeah. I want to read this last part and we'll call it a day on my notes. And this is working through Dr. Harold Cruz. I'm gonna read this little portion here. He states that, and this is on page 258 with the second full paragraph. He says, he contends, and this is Cruz, that there's a very real dilemma inherent in the African-American position. And this dilemma rests on the fact that America, which idealizes the right of the individual above everything else, is in reality a nation dominated by social power groups, right? Classes, in-groups, and cliques, both ethnic and religious. In fact, he continues, the individual in America has few rights that are not backed up by the political, economic, and social power of one group or the other. But given that African Americans are treated according to the power and position of their group, those Blacks, and there are many of them who have accepted the full essence of the great American ideal of individualism, are in serious trouble trying to function as Americans, right? So what he's saying is this notion, this concept, this fabulation of individualism that America propagates, right, that they promote, is really not about the individual, because how the individual is treated is based on the larger social group that they represent, right? If you remember in the beginning of the semester, I asked you, when you hear the word race and you're not thinking about identity, what is another word for that? What is another way to think about race when not thinking about identity? What is another way to think about race when not thinking about identity? What's the other way that we use race?
Could it be class?
But that still would formulate an identity, right? Because your class, how much wealth you had would determine what your identity is, right? So let's
like
kind of
the competition.
Thank you, Jessica. That's it. Competition, right? You race that track, right? It's a competition. So this is really why we have been classified as racist, because we're in competition for resources, right? And what he's arguing is they could talk about individuals all you want to, but what we really are looking at is how your racial group competes for resources will determine how you will be treated in this country, right? And you can see a very profound depiction of this when you closely analyze the Black wealthy, right? And I think about maybe 5-10 years ago at most, Dr. Henry Louis Gates out of Harvard, right? He was locked out of his home, trying to get into the window of his own home, right? And they called the police on him. And he was harassed for breaking and entering into his own home, right? So think about this. He's a Harvard professor, one of the well-renowned Harvard professors, right? So you know he ain't poor, right? Like he got a fat ass check from Harvard, right? So it's not an issue of class. And again, if he was an individual, they would recognize him as a wealthy professor emeritus of Harvard, right? That requires a certain amount of prestige, okay? But he Black. So his experience is tied to the larger Black experience. So when his neighbor sees him, and mind you, his neighbor, so if you live with somebody next door, you know what that motherfucker look like, right? You know that's your neighbor, right? So when his neighbor sees him trying to get in the window of his own home, they're prompted to call the police because him as an individual is not separate from how the world views the community that he's a part of, right? And when the police arrive on the scene, it's not about, let me see your ID so I can verify your address to the home, right? It's about treating him as a criminal because of the community that he comes from. So this is what the author is trying to, what his Cruz is trying to say, right? And how this notion of individualism is a misnotion, because how you're treated as an individual directly relates to how your group that you come from is looked at. What Frantz Fanon would call the historical racial schema, right? So your epidermis has a whole history that's tied to it. And because of the history of your epidermis, people are able to judge and classify how they'll treat you because of that history, right? It's the same claim that Cruz is making within this text. Not to even mention, right, that this notion of individualism is antithetical to African thinking and the way that Africans move, right? At Cal State LA, I teach an African manhood course. On my spare time, I run rites of passage trainings for young boys in San Bernardino, and it trains them on how to be a man, right? And one of the things that we instruct in both spaces is that the idea and the concept of a man was a community-owned concept. And you had to go through a certain criteria, and there were certain prerequisites that you had to go through to be considered a man. And if you did not go through those prerequisites, no matter what you said about yourself or how you felt about yourself, you were not considered a man, right? So if you didn't go through your boyhood rites of passage, if you didn't demonstrate physical prowess at adolescence, if you didn't marry and become a husband, and if you didn't have children, if you didn't meet those 4 criteria, you wouldn't be considered a man. So I'm bringing this up to show you how collectivism is quintessential for the African persona, right? Even the whole proverb of it takes a village to raise a child, right? Not that it takes an individual, it's a village that runs a child. So this collective notion is embedded in the way that African people operate, right? So this notion of trying to be an individual places African people out of pocket with their normative experience. And it's damaging. And not to mention, you know, all people, once you start to think individual, right, you lose empathy because you're only concerned about getting mine. And this system of capitalism is dependent on us only being concerned with ourselves. And it puts us in a false competition for limited resources. And this is why people of culture are always at each other's heads, because they made us believe that there's not enough. That's why some African people will be like, oh, all the Mexicans are taking the jobs from us. Nah, that's not the truth, right? There's enough of us for us all to eat, right? But this idea and this notion of individualism allows for us to feel that there's not enough. So I'm gonna be in competition with you and I don't want you to get what I have, right? Again, this is all the socialization that's taking place to make us do and think things. And if you're not critical, you'll just respond without knowing why you're responding the way that you do, right? Shit, I'm sorry, y'all, it's 12:30. You're supposed to do a fishbowl. I apologize. We'll have to get to that next week. Real quick though, I just want to kind of hear from some of y'all about what was covered. So let's just get 2 comments, then I'll ask Baba Pierre to close us out. Any questions, comments, or concerns, anything that you thought about what was talked about? Nobody?
No, I think I understood
Yeah, go ahead.
everything. Oh, no, I just said that I think I understood everything.
I'm sorry, say it one more time, bro. I missed you.
Oh, yeah, I think I was able to understand everything.
Okay. Anything stand out in particular that you kind of take away, Gabriel?
I think one
Is
thing
there
I
any-
wanted to add about like the questions, why is the distinction of Black sociology needed? There was this part in the text that says, moreover, Black sociology directs itself to the study of Black social reality from a Black perspective. So I think that right there where it says Black perspective, it's different from the white perspective. So that's why there needs to be a distinction of Black sociology.
Yeah, good call out. And that's okay, right? Like, it's nothing wrong with being different. Is when you're treated poorly because you're different, that's when we get a problem. So I think you're spot on with that, Gabriel. Thank you. Laura Ann, then Unique.
So I just said contemporary analysis. How does the reading relate to what's going on in the world today? The reading relates to what is going on in the world today because the Black culture still suffers from racism and hatred from other races. I'm not sure what all the hatred is about, but I would say it has a lot to do with jealousy and envy from other cultures and races. I don't know why people always decide to not like someone because they are different than the other person, but it is cruel. I would also mention that the reading is relatable to today's world because in politics, religion, and history, there's still a lot of ostracization that happens. I believe that in time, there will hopefully be such thing as no more racism. I believe that racist people should be arrested for being racist because what is all the hate about? I believe that we should live in a world full of peace, harmony, no more wars. I wish we could live in a world where everyone was nice to one another and there would be pure love and no hatred.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe that, and I see that in you, Laura Ann. Unique?
Well, I just found this passage on page 259 by Dr. Harold Cruz, where he says, in fact, America is an unfinished nation, the product of a badly prolonged process of intergroup cultural fusion. In itself, delusion and racist projects, it has effectively dissuaded, crippled, and smothered the cultivation of a democratic cultural pluralism.
Yeah.
I found like that, well, I found a whole lot of this chapter very like hitting my heart because like growing up, I wasn't taught a lot of like how to accept myself. So I became this people pleaser because I wanted to fit in with other people. But realizing as I grown up, well, I don't fit into anybody's, I mean, yeah, my skin complexion does, but mentally I am who I am. So I shouldn't have to please other people to accept me. I should be able to love myself enough to walk into anywhere and be like, this is me. I am who I am and live harmoniously amongst people, because in reality, we're supposed to be working together. We're supposed to be thriving and striving to just uplift everyone so that like be shared. Like we shouldn't be competing against one another. It's like I'm in competition with myself. How can I be a better person to effectively be in society and without this like putting my nose up to people or like because it doesn't seem right. Like everything just seems so blurred and foggy, and it shouldn't be like that. It should be, oh, you're doing that, oh, I can do that too, let's work together.
Yeah. Yep. So true. So true. One thing I'll offer you, as I mentioned, I do these rites of passage in San Bernardino, and they have like chants that they have to articulate. And part of one of the chants is self-love is a prerequisite to being fully human. Self-love is a prerequisite to being fully human. So in other words, if you don't fully love yourself, no one else is going to really love you, right? And you have to appreciate every aspect of who you are in its fullness. So that way you have that self-love, and that way others will know how to love you because you know how to love yourself. And because you know how to love yourself, you'll be able to establish boundaries that will allow you to maintain the brilliance of your true self, right? And fundamentally, and this kind of goes back to the IFA concept that we studied earlier, right? Like everyone is enough. Everyone has their own value. Like you were created in perfection. Even your imperfections are perfect, right? And that's kind of what you have to carry with you because that's the absolute truth. Nothing wrong. Because this is how the ancestors and the creator made you. So it's in divine order. Baba Pierre, can you close us out, brother? Baba, you there? You okay? Are we okay to close class out?